January 26, 1945. A frozen field on the edge of the Holtzwihr woods in Alsace, eastern France. 18 American soldiers are lying in a tree line, pressed flat against frozen earth, watching something that not one of them will ever be able to describe properly for the rest of their lives. 200 meters in front of them, an M10 tank destroyer is burning. The vehicle has taken a direct hit. Its crew has already abandoned it and run for the woods. Diesel fuel is leaking from a ruptured line. Smoke is pouring from the engine compartment. Somewhere inside that hull, stacked rounds of ammunition are heading toward a temperature that everyone in the tree line understands. When those rounds cook off, the turret will blow clean off the chassis, and anything alive within 30 meters of it will cease to be alive. On top of that burning vehicle, standing fully exposed in the turret ring, a single American officer is firing the .50 caliber machine gun into a wall of advancing German infantry. He is not crouching. He is not taking cover. He is rotating the gun in slow, controlled sweeps, pouring fire into white camouflaged figures who are crossing the snowfield from the direction of the village of Holtzwihr. There are approximately 250 of them. Behind the infantry, 6 German armoured vehicles are grinding forward through the snow, their main guns traversing toward the tree line where the 18 Americans are hiding. The officer on the tank destroyer is the only thing between those 6 vehicles, those 250 soldiers, and the total destruction of his company. He is 19 years old. He weighs 112 pounds. He stands 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. His name is Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, and at this moment in time, he is the most decorated combat soldier in the United States Army. Though the decoration he will be most remembered for, the Medal of Honor, is being earned right now, on top of a machine that is preparing to kill him. Private First Class Anthony Abramski is watching from the tree line. He will later swear under oath that he saw Lieutenant Murphy firing while bursts of machine pistol fire from the advancing infantry battered against the hull and treads around him. Sergeant Elmer Brawley, also watching, will testify that the German infantrymen got within 10 yards of Murphy, and that Murphy killed them in the draws, in the meadows, in the woods, wherever he saw them. Private Charles Owen, crouched behind a fallen tree, will say it the simplest way anyone ever said it. He saved our lives. If he had not done what he did, the Germans would have annihilated us. The men in the tree line are not watching a scene from a war movie. They are watching something they cannot reconcile with what they know about the man on the tank destroyer. Because every one of them knows what the United States Marine Corps thought of Audie Murphy, what the United States Navy thought of him, what the Army paratroopers thought of him, what his own 1st Company commander thought of him. They all thought the same thing. They thought he was too small to fight. The question that this story has to answer is not whether Audie Murphy was brave. The Medal of Honor citation will answer that. The question is something stranger and more unsettling. How did every institution the American military possessed for identifying who should and should not go to war look at this man and get it completely, catastrophically wrong? And what does it mean that the qualities which made him look unfit on paper, the smallness, the poverty, the childhood spent as the last line of defense for a family that had nothing, turned out to be the exact qualities that made him the most dangerous infantryman in the entire army? To answer that, we cannot start in the Holtzwihr woods. We have to start in a place that had nothing to do with war, unless you understand that for some people, the war began long before anyone handed them a rifle. Audie Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, a crossroads so small it barely qualified as a town, in Hunt County, northeastern Texas. He was one of 12 children born to Emmett Berry Murphy and Josie Bell Killian Murphy, sharecroppers of Irish and Scots-Irish descent, who worked rented cotton land around Farmersville, Greenville, and Celeste. 9 of the 12 children survived to adulthood. The family moved constantly, chasing tenancies that paid less each year as the Depression deepened, living in wooden shacks without electricity, running water, or insulation. His father, Emmett, drifted in and out of the family before disappearing for good sometime in the late 1930s. Murphy almost never spoke about his father afterward. When he did, it was with a flatness that suggested the wound had gone so deep it had stopped hurting and become something structural, like a bone that healed crooked and was now simply part of how he stood. The family lived the way millions of American families lived during the Depression, except worse. They ate what they grew and what they could find. Meat was rare, unless someone brought it home with a rifle. Shoes were shared between children. School was a luxury that competed with fieldwork, and fieldwork always won because fieldwork kept the family on the land and school kept the family nowhere. The shacks they rented had cracks in the walls wide enough to let in winter wind. Cotton prices fell to as low as about 5 cents a pound in the worst months, which meant a man could work a 12-hour day in the Texas heat and earn less than the cost of a meal for a family of 12. With Emmett gone, the family survived on what the children could earn. Audie dropped out of school after the 5th grade. He was 10 or 11 years old. He picked cotton for roughly $1 a day, dragging a canvas sack between rows in temperatures that could reach 110 degrees in July. He trapped rabbits. He shot squirrels and quail with a .22 caliber rifle that became, in his hands, an instrument of almost surgical accuracy. He was not hunting for sport. He was hunting because his brothers and sisters needed to eat, and he had decided, at an age when most American boys were learning long division, that keeping them fed was his responsibility. The rifle mattered. It mattered because a .22 caliber round was expensive when you had no money, and every shot that missed was food that did not arrive. Murphy learned to shoot the way a musician learns to play, through thousands of repetitions in which the stakes were immediate and real. He learned to control his breathing, to steady his hands, to wait for the moment the sight picture was exactly right, and to squeeze, not pull, the trigger. By the time he was 12, he could take a squirrel out of a tree at 50 yards with a single shot. Nobody taught him this. There was no one to teach him. He taught himself, the way he would later teach himself to read a battlefield, because there was no alternative, and the alternative to learning was failure, and failure meant empty plates. His mother, Josie, died on May 23, 1941. She was exhausted and ill, worn down by poverty and childbearing, and years of work that had no end point. Murphy was 15, possibly 16, depending on which birth year is correct, and the family shattered. His 3 youngest siblings were placed in an orphanage. The image of those children being taken away from him would stay with Murphy for the rest of his life. He would reclaim them after the war and support them financially for decades. But in 1941, standing at his mother's burial, he was a 5th-grade dropout, with no money, no father, no home, and a set of skills that fit exactly one occupation in peacetime. He could shoot, he could endure, and he could survive on nothing. Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the occupation he was built for suddenly existed. Here is where the story turns into something the United States military should study, not as an example of heroism, but as an example of institutional failure. Because what happened next is that every major screening system the American armed forces had for identifying combat potential looked at Audie Murphy and rejected him. He tried the Marines first, a recruiting sergeant, and this detail comes from Murphy's own memoir, glanced at his frame and told him he did not meet the physical standards. Murphy weighed about 110 pounds. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall. He had the face of a boy of 14. The Marines turned him away. He tried the Navy. The Navy turned him away for the same reasons. He tried the Army paratroopers. The paratroopers turned him away. He finally enlisted in the United States Army on June 30th, 1942, at Dallas, after his older sister signed an affidavit that listed his birth year as 1924 instead of 1925, making him appear old enough to serve. He was, in reality, 17 years old, 5 feet 5.5 inches tall, and 112 pounds. The Army took him because the Army in the summer of 1942 was taking almost everyone. He was sent to Camp Walters, Texas, for basic infantry training. He passed out during close order drill in the Texas heat. His company commander looked at this pale, underweight, baby-faced teenager and tried to have him transferred to cook and baker school, where he could serve out the war-making meals for real soldiers. Murphy refused. The other men in his unit called him Baby. Hold that word in your mind, Baby. Because the boy they called Baby would, within 28 months, earn the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the Legion of Merit, and the Medal of Honor. He would be credited with killing or wounding over 240 enemy soldiers. He would command a company in the most brutal infantry fighting in the European theatre and be the last officer standing when every other officer in his company was dead or wounded. And the Marine sergeant who sent him away, the Navy recruiter who shook his head, the paratrooper examiner who told him he was too light, they would all, if they ever learned who he became, have to live with the knowledge that they had looked at the most lethal combat soldier in the American army and seen a boy who should be cooking eggs. This is not a story about a man who was brave despite being small. This is a story about a country that almost lost its greatest soldier to a tape measure and a bathroom scale. And the reason it matters, the reason it is not just an anecdote but an indictment, is that the things that made Murphy look like a poor candidate for war were the very things that made him unstoppable once the war found him. He had been hungry his whole life. He knew what it felt like to keep going when the body said stop. He had been responsible for other people since the age of 10. He knew what it felt like to be the one who could not quit because there was no one behind him to pick up the load. He had been shooting for food since he was old enough to hold a rifle. His accuracy was not a military skill. It was a survival skill, drilled into him by thousands of hours of shooting rabbits for dinner, where a missed shot meant his family did not eat. The military's screening system was designed to find men who looked like soldiers. Murphy looked like a child. The system could not see past the surface to the thing underneath. And the thing underneath was a young man who had already been fighting a war, a private, invisible, merciless war against poverty and loss and the slow erosion of everything he loved for his entire conscious life. He was assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, Third Infantry Division. He shipped out from New York in February of 1943, arriving in Casablanca, French Morocco, on February 20th. He saw no combat in North Africa. He trained, he waited, and the division prepared for the invasion of Sicily. Sicily landed on July 10th, 1943. The 3rd Division came ashore at Licata on the southern coast in the pre-dawn darkness. Murphy was promoted to corporal 5 days later. His first recorded action involved shooting 2 Italian officers who were attempting to flee on horseback near Canicattì. The transition from training to killing was, by Murphy's own account, less dramatic than he had expected and more disturbing. He wrote later that the first time he fired at a man and the man fell, he felt nothing in the moment and everything afterward. The 3rd Division pushed north through Sicily in a race against the British 8th Army to reach Messina. Murphy's platoon fought through small towns and along mountain roads where German rearguards held every ridgeline. The fighting was disjointed and brutal, a series of small ambushes and sudden firefights, separated by long stretches of marching in dust and heat that left men hallucinating. Murphy's gift for reading terrain began to show itself here. He could look at a hillside and identify where an enemy position would be placed before anyone else in his platoon could see it. His company commander noticed. The war moved from Sicily to the Italian mainland. The 3rd Division was not part of the initial Salerno assault on September 9, 1943. It arrived roughly 10 days later, landing after the beachhead had been secured, and immediately joined the northward push against entrenched German forces. The fighting in Italy was a different kind of war from Sicily. The terrain was steeper, the rivers were wider, and the Germans were no longer retreating on their own schedule. They were dug in and fighting for every meter. Murphy fought through the Volturno river crossings, through the grinding winter campaign in the Italian mountains where rain turned every road into a stream of mud, and into the nightmare of Anzio. The Volturno fighting was particularly savage. In one ambush along the river, Murphy and one other survivor from his squad were caught in a German counterattack. The two of them, trapped behind a stone wall, used grenades and a captured machine gun to hold their position until the Germans pulled back, leaving 5 dead in the field in front of them. Murphy was beginning to demonstrate a pattern that would define his entire combat career. When the situation collapsed, when the men around him were dead or gone, he did not collapse with it. He became quieter, more focused, more dangerous. It was in Italy that the men around him started to realize that Murphy possessed something that could not be trained into a soldier and could not be identified on a physical examination form. He could think under fire. Not just function, not just suppress panic and follow the man in front of him. He could actually observe, process, and decide while bullets were passing through the air around his head. In the chaos of combat, where most men's cognitive ability narrows to a tunnel, Murphy's expanded. He could see the whole field. He could read the geometry of a firefight the way a chess player reads the board. He could act on what he saw faster than the men around him, faster sometimes than the enemy officers directing fire against him. This gift, and it is the correct word, was not taught. It cannot be taught. It is a function of temperament and the thousands of small decisions a person has made before they ever enter combat. Murphy had spent his childhood making life and death decisions with a rifle in his hands, deciding where to aim, when to fire, how to bring food home with no margin for error. The battlefield was different in scale. It was not different in kind. The squirrel in the tree and the German behind the wall required the same thing: steady hands, clear eyes, and the willingness to act when hesitation meant going home empty. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant on January 13th, 1944. He was hospitalized in Naples with malaria before the initial Anzio landing on January 21st, missing the first terrible days on the beachhead. He returned for the fighting around Cisterna, where the Third Division was locked into a perimeter so compressed that there was no rear area. Every man on the beachhead was within range of German artillery. The frontline troops lived in foxholes that filled with water every time it rained, which was constantly. They ate cold rations because cooking fires drew mortar rounds. They slept in shifts of 2 hours when they slept at all. Cisterna itself became a name that veterans of the Third Division did not speak lightly for the rest of their lives. The fighting there was close, personal, and unrelenting, with German and American positions, sometimes separated by less than the length of a football field. On March 2nd, 1944, near Cisterna, Murphy's platoon was sheltering in an abandoned farmhouse when a German tank appeared. The platoon engaged and killed the tank crew. Murphy then crawled out alone toward the disabled vehicle, armed with rifle grenades, and destroyed the tank itself. He received the Bronze Star with a Valor device. He would be hospitalized with malaria a second time in March. It would not be the last time his body tried to quit on him. His body was never the part that mattered. The Third Division fought its way through Rome, which fell on June 4th, 1944, and was pulled out for the invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon, on August 15th, 1944. Murphy landed near Ramatuelle on the Mediterranean coast with the first wave. And it was there, on the hillsides above the beach, that something happened that reveals more about who Audie Murphy actually was than any Medal of Honor citation ever could. His platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire from a fortified German position on a rocky hill. Murphy took a light machine gun and began working his way forward. During the fight, a group of German soldiers raised a white flag and began walking toward the American lines with their hands up. Murphy's best friend, a soldier named Laddie Tipton, stood up to accept the surrender. The Germans shot him. Whether the surrender was a deliberate ruse, or whether other Germans who had not surrendered opened fire, is unclear from the surviving accounts. What is clear is that Tipton fell, and Murphy saw him fall, and what happened next was not tactical, it was personal. Murphy attacked the position alone. He picked up the machine gun, charged forward, and began killing Germans at close range. The exact tally varies between his citation and his own later account, but the result was the same. Multiple enemy dead, several wounded, and the surviving defenders either captured or in retreat. He turned the light machine gun on additional positions until the resistance collapsed. For this action, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States Army. But the decoration is not the point. Laddie Tipton is the point. Murphy did not talk about most of the men he killed. He did not brag about them. He did not count them the way some soldiers did. But he talked about Tipton. He talked about Tipton for the rest of his life. In his memoir, in interviews, in conversations with friends decades after the war, Tipton's name came back again and again, like a debt that could not be settled. Because if you look at what Murphy did at Ramatuelle, and then look at what he did 5 months later at Holtzwihr, you see the same pattern. It is not the pattern of a man seeking glory. It is the pattern of a man who cannot leave. When someone near him is in danger, when someone near him is dying, the part of his mind that calculates risk and counsels self-preservation does not shut off exactly. It gets overruled by something older and louder. The boy who shot rabbits so his brothers and sisters could eat did not run from the farmhouse in Texas when things got hard. The soldier who watched his best friend die did not retreat from the hill in Ramatuelle. The officer who climbed a burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr did not climb it because he was fearless. He climbed it because 18 men were in the trees behind him, and he was not going to watch them die the way he had watched Tipton die, if there was anything he could do to prevent it. There is something else about Murphy that the men who served with him noticed, and that the official citations do not capture. He took risks that terrified the soldiers around him, but he did not take risks with their lives. His recklessness, if that is even the right word, was always pointed inward. He put himself forward. He drew fire onto himself. He sent his men back and stayed alone. The danger always flowed toward Murphy and away from the men he was responsible for. This was not a death wish, although several of his comrades wondered about that at times. It was something simpler and more difficult. He was a man who believed, at a level deeper than words, that his job was to stand between the people behind him and the thing trying to kill them. He had held that belief since he was a child. The war gave him the tools to act on it at a scale his childhood never could have. Every like on this video helps the story of men like Audie Murphy and Latty Tipton reach people who would never find it in a textbook. That matters more than any algorithm. Through the autumn of 1944, Company B fought through the Vosges Mountains in northeastern France, and Murphy continued to accumulate both decorations and wounds, with an almost mechanical regularity that begins to feel, when you read the records, less like a military career and more like a countdown to something inevitable. On September 15th, near Genevreux, a mortar shell landed close enough to kill 2 men beside him and wound 3 others. Murphy received his first Purple Heart. On October 2nd, near Clury Quarry, he killed 4 German soldiers with grenades at a range of 15 yards and received his first Silver Star. 3 days later, on October 5th, near Le Tholi, he crawled 50 yards under fire and spent an hour directing artillery onto German positions, personally accounting for approximately 15 killed and 35 additional casualties. He received a second Silver Star and a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. On October 26th, near Bruvliers, a German sniper's bullet ricocheted off a tree and tore a 9-inch channel through his hip. The wound became gangrenous, requiring surgery to remove dead tissue. He was hospitalized for approximately 2 months and received his second Purple Heart. Each of these actions would have been the defining moment of most soldiers' careers. For Murphy, they were entries in a log that was building toward a single afternoon in January. But there is a detail buried in the records of Company B that matters more than any individual decoration, and it is the detail that explains Holtzwihr. Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, landed in North Africa with 120 enlisted men and its full complement of officers. By the 3rd week of January 1945, 102 of those 120 enlisted men had been killed or wounded. Every officer except Murphy was a casualty. The company had been receiving replacements continuously, young men who arrived, fought, and were killed or evacuated so quickly that the survivors sometimes never learned their names. Murphy was 20 years old. He was commanding a company that had been fed into the line like coal into a furnace, and he was the last original piece of the machine still turning. He had malaria. He had combat fatigue so severe that he was not sleeping more than a few hours a night. He had been wounded 3 times. He had watched friends die in numbers that the human mind is not designed to absorb. And yet, in every engagement, he kept doing the same thing. He kept putting himself between his men and whatever was trying to kill them. This is the fact that does not fit into any official history of the war. Murphy's courage was not an event. It was a condition. It was the way he was built, and it was the way he had always been built, since a small boy in Hunt County decided that his brothers and sisters were going to eat no matter what. But here is the thing that separates Murphy's story from a simple tale of one extraordinary man. He was not alone in what he carried into the war. He was the most extreme example, the purest distillation, but the substance itself was everywhere in the American Army of 1944. The draft had pulled in 10 million men from every corner of a country that did not raise its children the way European countries raised theirs. American boys grew up in a culture where self-reliance was not an aspiration. It was a daily fact. Farm boys in Kansas had been operating heavy machinery since they were 14. Mechanics in Detroit had been pulling engines apart and rebuilding them on garage floors since they were 16. Boys from small towns across the South and the Midwest had been hunting, building, fixing, and improvising without adult supervision or institutional permission for their entire conscious lives. When you put men like that into uniform and handed them a rifle and dropped them into a situation where the chain of command had been destroyed, where the officers were dead, where the plan had disintegrated, they did not freeze. They did what they had always done. They looked at the problem. They found a solution. They acted. not because the manual told them to, because that was how they had been raised. Murphy was different from those men only in degree, not in kind. He was the extreme version of a national type, the boy who had been solving his own problems in the absence of any functioning authority since childhood. The Marine recruiter who turned him away was applying standards that measured bodies, not characters. He was measuring arms and chests when he should have been measuring the distance between a man's fear and his decision to act anyway. That distance, in Audie Murphy, was the widest the American Army had ever seen. The men who fought beside him understood this in a way that no citation writer or Hollywood screenwriter ever captured. Private First Class Irving Kelly, who survived Holtzwihr, said years later that he remembered being mad when Murphy ordered them to fall back to the tree line. Kelly's words were simple and direct. We wanted to stay and fight by his side. They did not want to stay because they were reckless. They wanted to stay because Murphy was the kind of man that other men do not leave, and being ordered to leave him alone on a burning tank destroyer while 250 German soldiers closed in on him was, for the men of Company B, physically painful. Now we come to the day itself. January 26, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, Alsace, France. The Colmar Pocket was a German bridgehead on the west bank of the Rhine, roughly 40 miles long and 30 miles deep, held by the German 19th Army under General der Infanterie Siegfried Rasp. It was the last significant German position west of the Rhine in the south, a bulge in the Allied line that tied down French and American divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. The Allied mission to collapse it had been assigned to the French First Army under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, reinforced by American units including the Third Infantry Division. The fighting in the Colmar Pocket was among the most miserable of the entire war, and that is not a statement made lightly about a war that included Stalingrad and Guadalcanal. Temperatures in Alsace in January 1945 were the coldest in decades. Snow lay deep across the fields and forests. The ground was frozen so hard that entrenching tools bounced off it, which meant soldiers could not dig foxholes, and had to lie exposed in the open or shelter behind whatever natural feature they could find. Trench foot and frostbite caused as many casualties as German weapons. Men's feet swelled inside their boots until the leather had to be cut away. Fingers went white and then black. Evacuations for cold weather injuries were running at rates that alarmed the division surgeons, who had already seen more casualties than they could process. The German defenders of the pocket were a mixture of Volksgrenadier divisions, remnant infantry formations, and small armoured Kampfgruppen. They were under strength, short on ammunition, and in many cases composed of soldiers too old or too young for frontline service. But they held advantages in terrain, in fortified positions, and in the sheer defensive power of frozen ground and narrow roads that channeled Allied attacks into predictable corridors. The fighting was a throwback to the Western Front of 1917, grinding attrition in winter weather that punished attackers far more than defenders. In the days before the 26th, the 15th Infantry had been pushing through the Riedwar woods toward the village of Holtzwihr. The 30th Infantry Regiment had been mauled in the same woods on January 23rd, encountering German armour and infantry, and withdrawing with heavy losses. The 15th was ordered to resume the attack. By the night of January 25th, Company B had pushed about 600 yards into the woods north of Holtzwihr. Murphy had 18 or 19 men, depending on the source. He was the only officer. At dawn, on the 26th, two M10 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived to provide support. They took up positions on the edge of the woods, facing the open snowfield that stretched south toward Holtzwihr. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, the Germans attacked. Murphy, positioned in a drainage ditch near the tree line, saw them coming through his field glasses. 6 armoured vehicles emerged from the direction of Holtzwihr, moving in a line abreast across the open snowfield, followed by waves of infantry in white winter camouflage. He estimated approximately 250 foot soldiers. The armoured vehicles were most likely Jagd Panthers, a heavy tank destroyer mounting an 88mm gun on a Panther chassis, though American forces at the time never confirmed the exact vehicle type, and some accounts suggest they may have been assault guns. The 654th Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion was operating Jag Panthers in this sector during the last week of January, making it the most probable unit involved. The supporting infantry is disputed in the historical record. Some sources identify them as the 708th Volksgrenadier Division, which was operating in the northern pocket with attached armour. Others, including eyewitness accounts published by HistoryNet, attribute them to the 2nd Mountain Division, recently transferred from Norway. What is not disputed is that the popular claim of Tiger tanks is almost certainly wrong. No Tiger tanks were documented in the Colmar Pocket during this period. The German artillery opened first, shelling the American positions in the tree line with a preparatory barrage designed to force the defenders into cover while the infantry closed the distance. One of the two M10 tank destroyers took a direct hit from a German main gun round and began to burn. The second slid into a ditch while attempting to maneuver and became stuck, its tracks spinning uselessly on the frozen ground. Both crews abandoned their vehicles and withdrew into the woods. Murphy was now facing 6 armoured vehicles and 250 infantry, with no armour support, no anti-tank weapons heavier than rifle grenades, and 18 men who had been in continuous combat for weeks. He ordered his men to fall back to the tree line. They did not want to go. Irving Kelly's testimony makes that clear. But Murphy was their officer, the only one left, and he gave a direct order. The men pulled back. Murphy stayed. Then he picked up the field telephone that connected him to the Artillery Fire Direction Centre and began calling in fire missions on the advancing Germans. From his drainage ditch, he adjusted artillery onto the German formations with the calm precision of a man who had been directing fire under combat conditions for over a year. But the Germans kept coming. The artillery was slowing them, not stopping them. The infantry was spreading across the snowfield, working toward the flanks. The armoured vehicles were advancing behind them, their guns beginning to range on the tree line where Murphy's 18 men were sheltering. And then Audie Murphy did the thing that no military manual would recommend, that no training exercise would simulate, and that no rational calculation of survival probability would support. He stood up from the drainage ditch, walked to the burning M10 tank destroyer, climbed onto the back deck, pulled himself up into the turret ring, and put his hands on the 50 caliber machine gun. The vehicle was on fire beneath him. Diesel fuel was leaking. Ammunition was stacked in the hull. Everyone who could see him, American and German alike, understood that the tank destroyer was going to explode and that the man standing on top of it was going to die when it did. Murphy opened fire. He rotated the heavy machine gun across the snowfield and began cutting into the German infantry at ranges that dropped from 200 yards to 100 yards to 50 yards. The Germans fired back with rifles, machine pistols, and machine guns. Rounds struck the hull around him. The smoke from the burning vehicle wrapped around his position, alternately concealing him and clearing to expose him fully. He kept firing. At one point during the action, Murphy was on the field telephone with the Fire Direction Centre, simultaneously firing the machine gun and adjusting artillery. A voice on the other end asked how close the enemy was. Murphy's response has been recorded in multiple eyewitness accounts and has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of the United States Army. He said, "If you just hold the phone a minute, I will let you talk to one of the bastards." He was not joking in the way a man jokes at a dinner party. He was making a statement of fact. The Germans were that close. A squad of German infantry worked its way through a draw and approached to within 10 yards of the tank destroyer. Murphy depressed the machine gun and killed them at point-blank range. For approximately 1 hour, Audie Murphy held that position alone, one man on a burning vehicle against 6 armoured vehicles and 250 infantry. He was wounded during the action, a bullet striking his leg and reopening the wound he had received near Bruveliers in October. He did not stop firing. The smoke from the burning tank destroyer grew thicker. The heat from the fire below him intensified. The men in the tree line watched and waited for the explosion that every one of them believed was seconds away. It did not come. Not yet. Murphy's machine gun fire, combined with the artillery he was directing onto his own position, broke the German attack. The infantry began to pull back. The armoured vehicles, unable to close on the tree line without their infantry screen, hesitated and then withdrew toward Holtzwihr. When the field telephone finally went dead and the last German soldiers disappeared back across the snowfield, Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer. He was limping. He was bleeding from the leg wound. He was covered in smoke and powder residue. His uniform was singed from the heat of the burning vehicle beneath him. He walked back to the tree line where his 18 men were waiting and the first thing he did was refuse medical evacuation. A medic tried to treat his leg. Murphy waved him off. There were men in worse shape than him, and there was ground to retake. He immediately organized his 18 men into a counterattack. These were exhausted soldiers, men who had been lying in the tree line watching their officer stand alone on a burning vehicle for an hour, expecting every second to see him blown apart. He told them they were going forward. They advanced across the same snowfield the Germans had just retreated over, through the craters left by the artillery Murphy had called in on his own position, past the bodies of German soldiers he had killed from the turret of the tank destroyer, and re-established the American forward position on the edge of the Holtzwihr woods. Shortly after Murphy reached the woods, the ammunition inside the M10 cooked off. The explosion blew the turret completely off the chassis. The blast was visible and audible from the American positions hundreds of meters back. Had Murphy remained on the vehicle for even a few minutes longer, there would have been nothing left of him to decorate. His Medal of Honor citation, published as General Orders No. 65 on August 9, 1945, describes the action with the restrained language the War Department reserved for the highest award the nation gives. It states that 2nd Lieutenant Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. It states that he climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its 50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. It states that he was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides. It states that he killed or wounded about 50 of the enemy. And it states that his indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented the Medal of Honor to Murphy on June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria. The ceremony was brief. Murphy stood at attention, still slight, still baby-faced, now 20 years old, while Patch hung the pale blue ribbon around his neck. He had also by that point earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 bronze stars with valor devices, 3 Purple Hearts, and decorations from both France and Belgium, including the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. His total came to 33 awards and decorations. No American combat soldier in the war is generally considered to have received more, though Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban, who received a belated Medal of Honor in 1980, has been cited by some historians as a comparable case. If your father or grandfather or any member of your family served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. The unit, the place, the thing they remembered, those details are the real history. They deserve to be kept alive by the families who carry them. The war ended. Audie Murphy came home. He was 20 years old, the most decorated soldier in the American Army, and the most famous enlisted man in the country. His face was on the cover of Life magazine. The actor James Cagney saw that cover and invited Murphy to Hollywood. A career in the movies began. He would eventually appear in 44 films, most of them westerns. In 1949, he published a memoir titled To Hell and Back, written with the help of his friend David "Spec" McClure. It was a bestseller. In 1955, Universal Studios made it into a film starring Murphy as himself. It became the highest-grossing movie in Universal's history up to that point, a record it held for 20 years until a film about a shark finally surpassed it. From the outside, the story looked like a fairy tale. A poor boy from Texas becomes a war hero and then a movie star, the American dream at its most concentrated. From the inside, the story was something else entirely. Murphy could not sleep. He had not been able to sleep properly since Italy. He kept a loaded 45 caliber pistol under his pillow every night for the rest of his life. He had nightmares in which the dead came back, men he had watched fall in Sicily, at Anzio, in the Vosges, in the Colmar Pocket. They visited him in the dark, and he could not make them leave. He woke in cold sweats with his hand already on the pistol grip before he was fully conscious. He had episodes of uncontrollable rage triggered by sounds or movements that reminded his nervous system of combat. A car backfiring, a door slamming, the particular quality of light in a room that reminded him of a muzzle flash. He could not hold a conversation in a crowded room without scanning every window and doorway for threats, a habit so ingrained that he did it automatically, the way a person breathes. A medical examination on June 17, 1947, documented persistent headaches, vomiting, and recurring war nightmares. The doctors noted the symptoms and filed the report. There was no treatment protocol because there was no recognized condition. In the 1940s and 50s, there was no clinical name for what was wrong with Audie Murphy. The military called it battle fatigue or combat fatigue, and the general attitude of both the armed forces and the civilian world was that a real man ought to be able to put the war behind him and move on. Murphy could not move on. The war had become a permanent resident inside his nervous system. It lived in his body. It expressed itself in insomnia, in startled responses, in the cold sweat at 3 a.m, in the pistol that never left the space beneath his pillow. He took pills to manage it. He gambled, possibly because a man who had lived at the edge of death for 2 years could not tolerate the flatness of ordinary life. In the mid-1960s, Murphy developed a dependency on a prescription sedative called Placidil. He was using it to manage insomnia that had been continuous for over 20 years. When he recognized the addiction, he locked himself in a hotel room for a week and withdrew from the drug alone, without medical supervision. It was, in its own way, consistent with everything he had ever done. He identified the problem. He decided it was his responsibility to fix it. He fixed it by himself because there was no one behind him to do it for him, just as there had been no one behind him in the cotton fields and no one behind him on the tank destroyer. His finances reflected the same pattern of a man who could survive anything except peace. Despite his fame and his film career, Murphy faced money problems throughout his later years, linked partly to gambling and unsuccessful horse-breeding investments. He refused to endorse alcohol or tobacco products because he did not want to set a bad example for young people, which meant he turned down the kind of lucrative deals that other celebrities used to secure their finances. The most decorated soldier in American history spent portions of his post-war life worried about paying his bills. And then Murphy did something that was, in the context of post-war America, almost as courageous as anything he had done in combat. He talked about it, publicly. At a time when veterans were expected to be silent about their suffering, Audie Murphy, the most famous soldier in the country, told reporters and audiences and anyone who would listen that war does things to a man's mind that do not heal on their own. He called on the United States government to study the long-term psychological effects of combat. He urged expanded medical benefits for veterans of Korea and Vietnam. He said plainly that the men who had served needed help, and that pretending otherwise was a betrayal of the promises the country had made to them. He was decades ahead of his time. The condition he was describing would not receive its clinical name to post-traumatic stress disorder until 1980, 9 years after his death. He was advocating for recognition and treatment of a wound that the medical profession had not yet agreed existed. He did it alone, just as he had done everything else alone, because the man who climbed a burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr was not the kind of man who waited for someone else to go first. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a small twin-engine Aero Commander aircraft near Roanoke, Virginia. He was 45 years old. He had been traveling on a business trip. The pilot, who held no instrument rating, took off into weather that was deteriorating rapidly. Rain and fog closed in over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Visibility dropped to near zero. The plane struck the heavily wooded west slope of Brush Mountain at approximately 2,700 feet, roughly 300 feet below the summit. All 6 people aboard were killed on impact. The National Transportation Safety Board attributed the crash to the pilot's attempt to continue visual flight into adverse weather conditions at an altitude too low to clear the mountainous terrain. Murphy was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971. A caisson drawn by 6 black horses carried his flag-draped casket from the Fort Myer Chapel to the cemetery. Among the mourners were 6 Medal of Honor recipients, his wartime division commander, and Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland. President Nixon was represented by Ambassador George H.W. Bush. His grave is in Section 46. At his own request, his Medal of Honor headstone was left plain, without the gold leaf inlay that recipients are entitled to. It bears his name, his rank, his dates, and his service. Nothing more. No mention of the 33 decorations, no mention of the tank destroyer, no mention of the 240 enemy soldiers, just a white stone in a field of white stones, the way Murphy wanted it. According to Arlington National Cemetery, after President Kennedy's grave, it is the second most visited site in the entire cemetery. People find it and stand there in silence, leaving coins on the white stone. So here is the answer to the question we began with. How did every institution the American military had for identifying who should fight look at Audie Murphy and see nothing? They saw nothing because they were measuring the wrong things. They measured height. They measured weight. They measured the circumference of a man's chest and the size of his arms, and whether his face looked old enough to belong on a battlefield. What they could not measure, what no tape measure or bathroom scale has ever been able to measure, was the thing that actually determines whether a human being will hold or break when the worst arrives. They could not measure the 10-year-old boy who decided his family was going to eat. They could not measure the teenager who buried his mother and watched his siblings taken away and did not lie down. They could not measure the part of him that had been forged by years of being the last one standing in a house where every other source of strength had failed or left. That part of Audie Murphy was invisible to a recruiting sergeant. It was invisible to a physical examination. It was invisible to every standardized test the military had ever designed. It was not invisible to the 250 German soldiers crossing that snowfield in Alsace. They found out what was inside Audie Murphy the hard way, at the business end of a .50 caliber machine gun, on top of a vehicle that was burning beneath him, fired by a man who would not get off, because the men in the trees behind him were all he had left in the world, and he had been the kind of person who does not leave since long before the United States Army decided he was worth keeping. The German records of the Colmar Pocket do not mention Murphy by name. Their war diaries record actions near Holtzwihr in late January 1945 as local counterattacks that failed. Armour lost. Infantry driven back with casualties. From the German perspective, it was a minor tactical setback in a pocket they were already losing. From the American perspective, it was the moment one man who had been told he was too small, too young, and too light to fight proved that the distance between what a soldier looks like and what a soldier actually is can be measured in nothing smaller than a lifetime. The Marine sergeant who turned him away never knew. The Navy recruiter who shook his head never knew. The paratrooper examiner who sent him home never knew. They cannot be blamed for following the standards they were given, but the standards were wrong. They were wrong because they assumed that the capacity to endure, to lead, to stand alone on a burning vehicle and refuse to leave was correlated with the size of a man's body. Audie Murphy proved that it was correlated with the size of something else entirely, something that grows in cotton fields and in houses where the food is never quite enough, and in the long, quiet hours a boy spends alone with a rifle, learning to hit what he aims at because the cost of missing is not a training grade. It is an empty plate on a table where children are waiting. Every fact in this account has been verified against military records, sworn eyewitness testimony, and the official Medal of Honor citation published in General Orders No. 65. The German force composition has been corrected where the evidence is clear and presented honestly where it is not. The popular claim of Tiger tanks at Holtzwihr is almost certainly wrong. The armour was most likely Jagd Panthers of the 654th Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion, though the Americans never confirmed the vehicle type at the time. The identity of the supporting German infantry remains disputed between the 708th Volksgrenadier Division and the 2nd Mountain Division. Murphy's M10 tank destroyer was exactly that, an M10, not the Sherman tank depicted in the 1955 film. His birth year is recorded as 1924 on his army headstone and enlistment papers, but his family, his biographer, and Murphy himself in interviews confirmed 1925, making him 17 at enlistment and 19 at Holtzwihr. The eyewitness statements of Abramsky, Brawley, Owen, and Kelly are drawn from sworn depositions and recorded interviews. Audie Murphy's grave at Arlington is marked with a plain white stone. Visitors leave coins on it, the quiet military tradition of honouring the dead. Some of them are veterans. Some are children whose grandfathers served with the Third Infantry Division. Some are people who know nothing about the war except that a boy from Texas climbed onto a burning machine and refused to get off because the people behind him needed him to stay. He was 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. He weighed 112 pounds. He was rejected by the Marines, the Navy, and the paratroopers. His company commander tried to send him to cook school. The men in his unit called him Baby. He earned 33 awards and decorations. He was credited with killing or wounding over 240 enemy soldiers. He held off 250 men and 6 armored vehicles with a machine gun on top of a burning tank destroyer for an hour in the snow, alone, wounded, 19 years old, because the 18 men in the trees behind him were his responsibility, and Audie Murphy had never in his life been the kind of person who walks away from the people depending on him. That was the secret. The Marine sergeant could not see it. The bathroom scale could not weigh it. The tape measure could not reach it. It was not in his body. It was in the thing that had kept a 10-year-old boy walking back to the cotton fields every morning, and that had kept a teenage hunter steady in the freezing pre-dawn, and that had kept a young soldier crawling forward when every other man in his company was gone. He did not climb that tank destroyer because he wanted to be a hero. He climbed it because that is what the people who raised themselves in empty houses, without fathers, without safety nets, without anyone behind them, do when the moment comes. They do not look for someone else to go. They do not wait for permission. They are already moving before the question is asked, because they learned a long time ago, in a place that had nothing to do with war, that if they do not do it, nobody will. If this story gave you something to carry with you, hit that subscribe button. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about men and women you have never heard of, who came from places no one remembers, and who did things that no recruiting sergeant on earth would have predicted, because the thing that makes a soldier was never on the form they were asked to fill out. It was already inside them, long before the uniform, and it is still inside the people who carry their names.